my trap and covered with lice when I was 10, so I killed it. And I recall how far I fell toward fact, toward something like truth, when those in-looking eyes went to peace in the godhood of my hand and left in me this dark and slow surprise that gnaws like a faithful cancer at the host. On the silent television stuck in my skull, the blind faces of children are bright as candles. The rump of a rooster gets himself up to crow. I see the soldiers crawling world without end. The darkness in our hearts is not what we think. We ask how this could happen. We pretend the darkness in our hearts is that we know. That's from The Only World There Is by Miller Williams. And I chose it to open this talk because what we're going to talk about is the process of helping someone come face to face with the darkness inside. I copied the poem so it's in your package of material, because I know sometimes people really like to be able to read a poem over and over again. In fact, I liked it so much I'll read it again. It's called How a Sparrow Was Caught in My Trap and Covered with Lice When I Was 10, So I Killed It. And I recall how far I fell toward fact, toward something like truth, when those in-looking eyes went to peace in the godhood of my hand and left in me this dark and slow surprise that gnaws like a faithful cancer at the host. Addiction is like that. It gnaws like a faithful cancer at the host. Once it gets in you, it gnaws like a faithful cancer at the host. On the silent television stuck in my skull, the blind faces of children are bright as candles. The rump of a rooster gets himself up to crow. I see the soldiers crawling world without end. The darkness in our hearts is not what we think. We ask how this could happen. We pretend the darkness in our hearts is that we know. I hope, as we go through this conversation that we're beginning, that the relevance of this particular poem becomes more apparent as I begin the conversation by articulating my understanding, or at least some of my understanding of addiction, as it continues to unfold, and specifically what I think is the most neglected area of addiction treatment, that is actually talking, having therapeutic conversations with actively using drug addicts, alcoholics. We'll just leave it there. There's all kinds of addictions now. Everything's become an addiction. I'm not so sure I buy into that, but when there are certainly addictions to drugs and alcohol, and to nicotine, I believe. And the person who is actively using prior to getting into recovery is a very neglected area of the therapeutic population for a lot of important reasons. Important but not so good reasons, in my opinion. And I want to address that population specifically because I think that's where we're going to get the most bang for our therapeutic buck. Because the great bulk of the damage done by addiction is done when people are actively using. Before they go to the rehab, before they, quote unquote, hit bottom. And there's a bias built into the field and built into the culture that there's really not a whole lot you can do with somebody who's actively using. Now, the way the unconscious mind works is very interesting to me. I have a personal story associated with my interest in this, but the story only came to my awareness after I was already doing it. And I sort of backed into the field of psychotherapy by working in one of these little drop-in centers back in the early 70s. And it was one of these little drug drop-in places, and people would come off the street, or you'd go out and do what we called outreach work. I'd hang out at the Dairy Queen with the high school kids, and with my long hair and my beads and my bell bottoms, and it wasn't a costume. I mean, it was a costume, but it was also what I wore. And I had always wanted to become a psychologist, and not always, but after a certain point in my life, I knew that's what I wanted. I didn't know that it was going to paint a big, bright scarlet A on my chest to work in addictions. But in those days, addiction and mental health treatment were considered miles apart, further apart much more than they are now. And if you worked in addiction treatment, you were pretty much contaminated. You were pretty much not welcome in the normal mental health world. And when I was a little boy, my mother was bipolar. And somewhere in her 30s, she started to drink. And being the good, aspiring psychotherapist that I was, of course, trying to help her. And I don't know that you have to be a good, aspiring psychotherapist, but mostly sons, oldest sons, want to do right by their mother. And my mother was, quite ill, and when she started drinking, she became very depressed and basically unmotivated and lethargic and all those other things. And now I know that, of course, she was medicating her bipolar illness, but at the time I just thought that, she had to stop drinking. And I kept encouraging her to go to a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist. I kept encouraging, this is back in 1966, 65, 66. And lo and behold, one day, she decided, okay, I am going to go see the psychiatrist. And my uncle, who was a medical doctor, recommended one of his people at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City. And on the appointed day, she went for her appointment. And I think it's a little odd that a 15-year-old would be waiting around for his mother to come home from a psychiatrist, wanting to know how things went, but that's what I was doing. And she came home, and I said, well, Mom, how did it go? And she said, oh, Thomas, he was a very nice man. I said, okay, Mom, but I mean, like, how did it go? How did your conversation go? Well, he's a very nice man, and he was a nice man. I said, Mom, what did you talk about? Oh, we talked about my life and so on and so forth. I was getting nowhere with her. I finally said, so when are you going to see him again? And to this she said, he won't see me again. And I was stunned. And I said, why not? Well, he said he wouldn't see me unless I stopped drinking. So he told me that I should stop drinking, and then he would see me. And of course, my heart broke at that moment. And I thought, my God, there's no hope. Because, see, I thought that a certain sort of conversation from a person who knew how to have it with my mother would somehow get her to the next step. I thought a certain kind of conversation between a trained professional person and my mother would do some good. But from his point of view, there was no point in talking to my mother because she was drinking. And until she stopped drinking, there couldn't be any psychotherapy. Now, this is a bias in the field of psychiatry and psychology that exists to this day. As recently as 3 months ago, I heard this story repeated to me by a person I was seeing for the first time. 3 months ago. So here's my dilemma. Like, if thousands of people all over the world find their way to self-help programs by hook or by crook, why is it that talking to a trained professional can't get you there? what is wrong with the way psychology and psychiatry thinks about that conversation that makes that such an unlikely outcome. An outcome that's so unlikely that it's not worth entering into it. So I'd be lying if I said that, my mom's story is the reason I ended up getting into addiction treatment, because it's not. Although, in this odd way that our lives kind of continually fold back on themselves, maybe it is. Really, maybe it is about that. Because it's a pretty compelling story in my life, and it's a story that keeps repeating itself, oddly, 40 years later. So the proposition that I'm making in this presentation is that a certain sort of conversation with an actively using drug addict or alcoholic can help them get to that place that I think most of this conference is about, which is, a certain sort of epiphany, a moment of truth. That just because someone's using drugs and alcohol doesn't make it impossible for them to have that happen. It certainly undermines the likelihood of it. After all, they're not thinking with their right mind. But that's not the therapist's problem. That's the client's problem, and mostly we don't help them to have their problem. We mostly try to take it away from them somehow. So I want to just articulate some of the biases in the helping profession that I think contribute to the dilemma. The first bias I've articulated is the need to be helpful. Well, it's fine to be helpful to people with most things, but if somebody is struggling with something that they can't control and they don't know it, helping them to control it doesn't add to the likelihood that they're going to realize that they can't. Does that make sense? See, if part of what I'm doing is you have a problem with this and I'm going to help you to control it, if the underlying issue is that this is not a controllable thing, by me being helpful, I'm suggesting that it is controllable. And you're just simply not being a very cooperative client, which is why the psychiatrist told my mother not to come back, I'm sure, because he'd probably had 50 of these people. Because he was busy trying to help them to control something that wasn't controllable. And of course, the second bias is belief in control. And you don't have to go very far in reading Western psychology. It's all about control. It's shot through everything. All of our cognitive behavioral therapies. There's something about this idea of control that is so intoxicating, so appealing, that I think an argument can be made that we're addicted to the idea. I don't know what people's political persuasions are, but certainly you could explain a lot of what we've done since 9/11 as an effort to control something that appears to be not controllable. Does that mean we shouldn't do it? No. But we shouldn't be selling it in the way we're selling it. We shouldn't be selling it as a way to, we are going to make, we will win this thing. There are certain sorts of things you don't win with. And this idea of control, of course, it's tied up with our need for security and our need to feel safe and so on and so forth. But one of the arguments I'm going to make later in the presentation is that the only security we have is to develop our capacity to tolerate distress. The only security we have as humans on the planet is our capacity to tolerate distress, because we don't know what the hell's coming. And I don't know what it's going to be like on that day, when I'm in such pain from cancer or such whatever. I don't know what it's going to be like. But I know that if I can cultivate my capacity to tolerate distress, I'm going to have a lot better chance of getting through that with something like dignity, than I would be if I were busy trying to get rid of every little distress that I had, which is what we mostly do, at least in the American culture. I have to remind myself that I'm in Canada, and that maybe you guys are a little less compulsive about gratifying every conceivable need before we even experience it. Difficulty tolerating client distress. The desire to offer comfort. That's a big, big part of doing psychotherapy and the motivation for it. Mostly, we get something out of giving comfort as clinicians. We often elicit, we invite the person's pain into the room, and then by our company with them, we comfort them. But we also have the fear of doing harm. So if you've ever been in that situation where you're talking to somebody and you can see that somehow what you're saying to them is making them feel worse, and that moment of like ambivalence, where you really have to let yourself surrender to the need to give comfort, to allow them to feel what it is that they're going to feel, and to recognize that you're an agent of their pain. You're not the cause of their pain, but you're the agent of their pain. If they weren't talking to you, they wouldn't be thinking about this stuff in the same way. They wouldn't be feeling it as intensely if you're doing good work. This is a real big one. Belief in the healing power of the therapeutic relationship. It's a bias. How often do you hear about the therapeutic relationship as being the thing, the curative factor? Well, it is the curative factor in a lot of therapy. But it ain't when you're dealing with someone who's actively using. Because they'll lie to you. Why the hell wouldn't they lie to you if they're lying to their wife? If somebody's lying to their wife, hello, I should be easy to lie to. So what kind of therapeutic relationship are we having here with somebody? See, the presumption is that the person I'm talking to can enter into a covenant with me, can choose to make an agreement with me. So we're going to have therapeutic contracts. Well, you can have a therapeutic contract with someone who's a free agent, but what I'm suggesting is that an actively using addict is not a free agent. And so why would you attempt to enter into contract with them except to create the illusion of control in them, which does what? Makes it harder for them to realize they don't have it. When I talk to somebody and act as if they can make an agreement with me, sometimes, enlightened parents or not so enlightened parents do this with their kids. Kid's not a free agent. It's developmentally, they're not there. They can't agree to not hit their sister. They can try. You can build infrastructure. Come to me when you want to hit your sister. But the likelihood is that they're not at a point where they are free to choose. I thought early this morning I was listening to, is it Marlatt? Is that his name? Wonderful keynote thing and the beautiful, beautiful video. My God, how powerful. And this woman got up and said, finally, I don't have to do whatever I want. Wait a minute. If you want it, doesn't that imply choice? See, so when somebody says to you, why do you drink? Oh, I want to drink. You see? This woman's saying, finally, I don't have to do whatever I want. Well, is it possible that her conception of herself as a free agent, meaning if I do it, I must want to, embedded in what she's saying is she doesn't know that she's not doing what she wants. She doesn't know that she doesn't have control until that moment, the epiphany where she realizes I have control. I don't have to do whatever I want. I get to choose to do what I want, or I get to choose to not do what I want. So in the phenomenology of an actively using addict, this idea of control and free choice in the phenomenology. They believe they have it, okay? And they talk to you as if they do. A guy I saw years ago, and I'm going to tell therapeutic stories during this presentation. I've already done things I wasn't supposed to do. Like I was supposed to tell you before we get started what I was going to do. So this is what's going to happen. This is how we're going to use some of our time. I'm going to articulate some ideas. I'm going to tell you some stories, some therapeutic stories. I'm going to read some poems. We're going to go through the outline as much as we can, but I gave you the outline because once we finish talking, I'm hoping a lot of that's going to be self-explanatory. What I hope to have happen is to create an atmosphere of curiosity and community and collaboration and shared struggle. And I want to connect with you at this level because I think it's so important. These are the people who most need our help and that we have very limited way of thinking about it. Almost always it involves implying control when they don't have it. Almost always it enables the addiction in some odd way. And until they hit bottom, a different way of thinking about it is required. So here's a story. This woman comes to me, 6 months pregnant, showing big, waddles into my office and sits down, and she says, my husband is, I don't know what to do. He's screwing around with another girl. We're ready to have our first child, and he's out gallivanting all the time doing X, Y, Z. So I do a structured interview with her about drinking, which I'm going to, right now, first client you see, everybody you see, if you don't ask them about drugs and alcohol, it's unlikely people will tell you spontaneously. So you need to ask them. So I ask her. She said, well, I don't drink because since I've been pregnant, I haven't drunk at all. But my husband drinks. I said, well, how much? She said, well, I don't really know. So do you have a ballpark idea? Well, I know he goes out drinking after work every day, okay? And what about that? Well, I do, when I shop, I buy. So I said, tell me what you buy. And I sit down and I write it down. 2 cases of beer per week and a half a gallon of rum. So this is for whom? This is for my husband. So 2 cases, a half a gallon of rum. That's a lot of booze. She says this to me. That's a lot of booze. It's almost as if, as she was just doing the shopping, somehow 2 cases of beer and a half a gallon of rum didn't seem like a lot of booze. It seemed like, we're buying, milk and bread and cookies and so on and so forth, okay? Because the longer you're around addiction, which is intractable, the more your belief system shapes itself to the intractability of the problem. You see, so you start to believe stuff that you would never think you'd believe if you said somebody, like before this lady got married, before you met her husband, would you think 2 cases of beer and a half? Yeah, it'd be ridiculous. I wouldn't buy that. Well, you're doing it now, girl. So I'll make a long story shorter. Eventually, the guy comes to see me. He says, I'll talk to Mallouk. I'll talk to you, shrink. What the heck? Why not? And so we're talking, and in the 3rd session, he's sitting there. Well, you're sitting there. You're me. He's sitting here. Doc, the bottom line is, I love booze more than I love my wife. So I'll see you later. Walks out the door. Walks right past me, right out the door. Gave me my $50 beforehand, but walked right out the door. Well, if you're dealing with a person who's a free agent, it's okay. Next case, right? Well, of course, his wife calls me, wants to see me. We spend a lot of time talking. I help her to realize, no, she doesn't have to put up with X, Y, Z. She doesn't have to put up with the girlfriend. She's upset because he only comes home at midnight, stays till 7 or 8 in the morning, and leaves. She's getting tired of his dirty clothes, doesn't want to be doing his laundry. So I help her to not do that anymore. You don't have to do his laundry. You don't have to even keep the stuff in the house. So a bunch of different things happen. Among them, she puts all of his stuff out the door. closes the door, changes the locks, calls him up and says, your stuff's outside. If you want it, come get it. It's supposed to rain in an hour. You know, this kind of, I help her do this kind of stuff. But she then says to me, well, what should I tell him? I said, well, I have no idea, what you should tell him. I mean, tell him your unborn son needs a father. Tell him whatever you want. I don't know what, and I had to think to myself, well, I'll tell you what, tell him this. Tell him Dr. Mallouk is thinking about him. She said, what? I said, if you need to tell him something, tell him that Dr. Mallouk is thinking about him. So I see her the next week, and as I often do with people, same question, what should I do? What should I tell him? I said, well, tell him Dr. Mallouk is thinking about him. Well, 3 weeks before his wife delivers, I get a phone call. Dr. Mallouk, can you help me get into a rehab? I said, yeah, I'm going to put you on hold. And in those days, you could actually send somebody to a rehab. In those days, I could make a phone call, and Ray Johnson at the Fairmount Institute would say, yeah, we got a bed. When do you want to, send him to a rehab? Okay, so why does that work? Now, I don't want to pretend that somehow Dr. Mallouk had this interesting intervention figured out. I was flying by the seat of my pants, folks. I didn't understand this stuff the way I understand it now. Okay, but I knew that this guy was full of something when he said, I love booze more than I love my wife. Nobody loves booze more than love. They just don't. And something else was going on. I didn't know what it was, but I knew he was sick. And I knew that lots of people call me Tom, but when I want to play the doctor, I can play the doctor. So somehow I knew that to say Dr. Mallouk, who the hell, what do doctors think about? Who do doctors think about? I was sending them the message, you're a sick person. You're not a bad person. And so at the moment when he wanted to come in from the cold, when he didn't want to be a bad person anymore, a wise guy, bad person, but a bad person, he got a chance to upgrade. I gave him a chance to upgrade from being bad to being sick. And that's a huge improvement. And so he ended up getting sober. He ended up tearfully on his knees dedicating his sobriety to his son who was born while he was in rehab. Yeah?
As you're sharing that, my head kind of went off in a little bit of a different avenue.
Okay.
Very similar thing happened in my practice recently as well. When you said to his wife, Dr. Mallouk, tell him Dr. Mallouk is thinking about him, it is a message, is it not a message of love? So that when he said, I love booze more than I love my wife, the word love is what's key. And you said, tell him I'm thinking about him, which is that your love is perhaps kick it up a notch higher than the love for the bottle and his wife that he had going. I don't always use words right here.
What are you trying to say? Are you asking a question? You're trying to say? I think
it's perhaps about love and the fact that you showed, like the patient-doctor thing, but also that you showed an interest in him.
Right.
Despite his
Right.
alcoholism.
Yeah, I intuitively understood that the person he was calling I love booze more than my wife. I intuitively understood that. I like this guy. That he was trying to be honest. He was trying to be honest. And as far as he knew, if he's looking at his own behavior, I'm acting, what he wasn't saying is I'm acting like a person who loves booze more than he loves his wife, because he doesn't know that there's a person trapped inside of his addiction, the human being trapped inside of his addiction. And that's a concept I want to talk about later. Addiction imprisons people. You don't get to talk directly to them. You don't get to talk directly to them. You don't get to say to them, this doesn't make any sense, Fred. You don't get to do that. You get to tap on the pipes and hope you hear tapping back. You have a hostage crisis when you're dealing with actively using addicts. A hostage crisis. And it's totally different than a conscious, willing, willful, capable person in front of you. Even though They might keep a job. They might do all kinds of things. Because when it comes to that, see, the great thing about addiction is it'll even let you stop using for a while. Your addiction will let you have control for a while. Why? So that it can live in the future. See, if you think of it as an organism, it will actually allow you to demonstrate control for the purposes of its continuation. And I'm a great example of that. I quit smoking in 1967. And I had my last cigarette in 1986. 19 years later. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
But what I want to know from you is whether your life's working.
Yeah.
No, it's not. You want it to work.
Right.
Yes. Okay. Well, how do we get there?
Right.
But when I was in addiction, 20 years, I lived in the world of best intentions.
Right.
I could come to you and be so sincere, it would be unbelievable.
Right.
How sincere I am.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the next day, I could go to the banker and borrow the $1,000, and I was going to pay him back.
Right.
And he wouldn't see a thing.
That's exactly right. That's those stories, and that it speaks to the fact that you weren't the guy running your life. And people who haven't experienced that, see, I don't know. All of us are going to come face to face with something like that in our life. I think the addicts are the lucky ones. They got a substance, and they get it generally earlier in life than most of us, So they get a leg up on future wisdom if they can come to terms with it. I just want to let you know, we're not going to have enough time. All right, let's just get right up front with that, okay? I'm going to do my level best to maximize what we get out of this, but you're going to leave, if everything I'm planning works out perfectly, you're going to leave wanting so much more. You're going to leave so unsatisfied. Well, I shouldn't say that. You're going to leave sated, but wanting to come back to the table. Like a good meal. Yes, dear? I'm sorry. Because of the scattering way that we did this, everybody should have a handout. Does anybody, who doesn't have a handout? All right, included in your handout is the outline, which is going to be projected up here that I'm going to go through somewhat. There are two figures in the outline, one illustrating the circular nature of addictive process from an intrapersonal perspective, the other articulating the circular nature of the addictive process from an interpersonal perspective. Okay? This is highly theoretical on one level. I try to make it as concrete as I possibly can through the stories and so on. But my brain works that way. I can think very abstractly, but when you're having a conversation with a client, you need to be in the moment with them, and you're the client right now. So we're going to try to stay in the moment together. And I don't want to lose people in the theory. What you were talking about there with sincerity, I mean, that's the hook for a lot of clinicians. This person appears so sincere. I mean, my guy who walks in says, the bottom line is I love booze more than I love. He wants to go, well, then go screw yours. There's no love coming. You don't want to love this guy back. He's not doing anything. But lots and lots of people are well-meaning and well-intentioned, and they go out and do horrible things. Yes?
Well, I think that guy, as controversial as it might be to be head-to-head with him, he is trying to be that sincere with just, I have
Right.
more will to put in the effort into doing the things that are loving towards my drinking than putting in the effort to the loving towards my wife. I can't do it.
Right.
I
See,
can't do it.
the only thing I would argue with there is that there's effort involved. See, he's compelled to drink. He's not trying to drink. He's accepting, he's acknowledging.
No, but he's doing the action, right? He's going out and getting it. He's making sure that it happens. He's putting in the work to make that addiction go. He's not putting in the work to make the marriage go, to make the love go, to make like his self grow. That kind of work he can't do yet.
Right.
But he knows he can make sure that.
In my way of thinking about this, there is no work in me biting my nails. There is no work in my compulsions. The work is in there's two things, and this is really important, I think. The first thing is to surrender, to realize, to have that moment, and then there's real work involved. I mean, what I say about addiction is there is no psychotherapy without abstinence, but you can have psychotherapy before abstinence. In other words, the goal of the psychotherapy is different, but you don't get any growth, any personal growth, and this is why you get developmental delay in recovering people. You're working with a 47-year-old who, when they stop drinking, is about 6. They're married, they've got children, they're parents, they've been, but they haven't developed, there's no development. Because that's very too complicated to talk about, but basically, if at every point along the way you tolerate, you deal with your distress by medicating it, you never learn from the experiences that the distress is supposed to teach you. The distress is there as a teacher, as a guide, for you to learn things that you otherwise couldn't learn. And anybody who has little children and sees how frightened they get when they start to take their first steps and they're terrified, well, if you don't let them feel that, if you pick them up, they don't walk. You have to coach them. It's okay. You can do it. I understand. You're constantly balancing glue and solvent. And then they're walking. And they're walking. But if you never allow yourself to experience the distress, then you don't develop. And that's the problem. I mean, a lot of times people who get into recovery, it's very tough. After the first year, it can be very, very tough because you have to confront all the things you haven't yet done. Now, having said that, it's a little bit like me learning to read. I couldn't read till the 5th grade. A lot of work had been put into me learning to read, but I couldn't read. My mom's got me down on the floor, and the word is R-E-M-E-M-B-E-R. Remember. Remember. I could say it as fast as I wanted, but it never became remember. Once I got it, I went to be a 12th grade reader in 18 months. And a lot of times it's that way with, there are things that you've been doing over the time of your active addiction that eventually fill themselves in, and it's not chronological. It's like there's a quantum leap can happen. So going back to the biases in helping professions, bias towards confronting denial. See, a lot of therapy of actively using people is designed to confront denial and to put it in people's face. And whereas I think that does work, you have to have the guns. You have to have, if you're going to go with a power move in therapy, then you have to have enough power behind you to make it stick. And then you also got to be prepared for the resentment later, the backlash later from the client. Because nobody can be made to surrender, and have them want to live in peace with you later. If we enforce an intolerable surrender on the enemy, then the enemy later will come back and bite us on the ass. They're not going to be our friends. So when you're dealing with confrontation, which is, by the way, the stock and trade of most places that I know of, it's like if you hold up enough mirrors to somebody with enough people, it can work. But I think there's a bias towards it, and there's other ways of going about things that are much less direct, but far more powerful. And here's the last one. Well, there's always blame the victim. There's always blame the victim. We can always trot that out. There's a little bit of the blame the victim in what you're saying, about this guy not willing to do the work. He'll do the work to get his booze, but he won't do the work to love his wife. Well, that's an argument, but my belief is that he wants to love his wife and he can't. He can't because something is ruining and running his life and he doesn't know it. He doesn't know it. That's the key thing. He doesn't realize it. He thinks he's in control.
But he has a passion there, like there's a different kind of a passion and a pull and a drive that comes together, even though it's a negative passion, he can feel that drive more than the pull towards doing the work.
I don't know what to say about that because I don't know that. I mean, I understand your argument, but I don't know that. I mean, I can tell you a story about me with my cigarettes. When I finally stopped smoking cigarettes, okay, I quit cold turkey when I was 19. I got in incredible shape. I rode. I was an Adonis, in my own opinion. And then slowly, you know, I got a thing with a bone spur, so I couldn't row anymore. One of my roommates smoked cigarettes. The other guy bummed them once in a while, so I bummed them with him. And you know, pretty soon I'm back to smoking. That's the same old story. And then I got with Eileen, my wife, and we were going on our first camping trip together up to New Hampshire. And I pulled my beat-up old BMW, we all had one of those, into the service station. I said, well, we need gas, and I got to get a pack of cigarettes. And she says, well, you know, I don't like that you smoke cigarettes. I said, you don't? She said, no. I said, I'll quit. So I had two, smoked the last two, never had another one for several years. She also wanted me to lose weight, I found out later, and a bunch of other things. And I started to get a little nervous. But I did lose 17 pounds. But I've never succeeded in, I'm keeping the nail biting going at a low grade to keep her occupied. Because everything else I kind of like about myself. So this one day, this day happened where I went, she was in medical, she was a resident, and it was New Year's Day in Philadelphia. And I think it was like 1980 maybe or something like that. And it was 61 degrees that day. And I had sent her off to the hospital at 5:30 in the morning because she had to be there by 6. And me and the German Shepherd on New Year's Day are sitting there, and we got nothing to do. And so I'm reading one of my fishing magazines, and in there I find out about a stream in Harrisburg that's only an hour and a half away, and Vanessa and I start talking about it, and she starts wagging her tail, and she says, let's go. You know? Well, if the Shepherd says let's go, you go. So we packed the stuff in the Datsun. Now I'm down to a Datsun because I'm married. And we take off for Harrisburg, and lo and behold, after a couple of hours of searching around, I find this place, and I rig up my fly fishing gear, and I go down to the stream, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's 65 degrees. The water is gin clear. You can see the trout in the water, and I'm trying to fish away and can't catch a fish. So I'm thinking, so we start, you know, one of the best ways to catch fish, to learn how, you know, you can put a lot of time in on the stream, or you can find somebody who knows what they're doing and pick their brain. So, what do you think I did? I walked up, sure enough, I see this guy up there. I wonder if he's any good. Well, this guy's throwing loops, you know, like 60-foot loops in a canopy of trees that's, you know, 25 feet wide. I mean, he's beautiful. And I'm watching him, and sure enough, he hooks a fish. So I'm walking up the bank. I got Vanessa, and I'm thinking, how do I break into a conversation with this guy? Well, he comes to the bank, releases the fish, and lights up a cigarette. So I go up to him and go, hey, can I bum a cigarette? Because why? Because I can't tolerate the distress of saying, you know, I really would appreciate it if you could help me catch a fish. See, because that's too personal, it's too something, it's too whatever. And what's the big deal? It's just one cigarette. So I have this cigarette. Now, I remember that cigarette vividly. Even to this day, I remember that cigarette. But I don't remember the next one. I don't remember the next one. It wasn't the next day. It wasn't until probably a couple months later. But I can't tell you when it was, because I don't know. Now, how do you account for that phenomenologically? The taste of that cigarette buried itself. It's like a little worm. And got in there, and it says, now I'm here. And I'm going to get nice and warm and cozy in this guy's psyche. And now I'm going to... See, because up until that point, I was demonstrating control, right? All right, so now, I'm not smoking a lot of cigarettes, honey. I only want one after a good meal, and I want one here, there, and there. And, you know, now we start to have babies, and she's like tired of tired of, making me her life project. She's got children now, or at least one. Make them a project. And so I got off a little scot-free there. So now I've convinced her that it's okay for me to smoke a little. So now, where we get to the end of our story, my hitting bottom experience, now I'm down to 10 cigarettes a week, or up to 10 cigarettes a week. Never more than 10. Okay? I have one on the first tee, and one on the 10th tee when I play golf, and I play golf at least twice a week. So that's 4, or actually 3 times a week, that's 6. And then one after a meal at a restaurant. Not at home, has to be at a restaurant. I never buy them. I buy them for other people, give them to them, and then bum them back. You got this, right, Dave? When I go to a restaurant, okay, I grease the waiter $5 before we start and say, at the end of this meal, I want you to get me a good cigarette. And they always got me a good cigarette. So in those days, you could smoke in a restaurant. So I got this whole thing figured out. I mean, I'm a poster boy for control. 8 to 10 cigarettes per week, only at exactly prescribed times. So Megan comes along. April 28th, 1986. And now it's June, early June. In those days, I would go out and play at the public golf course at the crack of dawn, before first light. A bunch of married guys with kids would get there. We'd show up. The pro shop would let us play before they opened. As soon as we could see, we'd hit the ball. At demonstrating control. I might have been a little more resourceful, but in terms of how much of a prisoner of my own behavior, my own addiction, I was a prisoner. And I got my wife to back off. I mean, I had gotten it all figured out. She wasn't upset anymore. I thought I had won an important victory in the marital struggles. You see? After all, a man's got to do, what a man, it's just garbage. It's just garbage. So here, I'm going to just talk about the intrapersonal context of addiction. I hope I didn't offend those people. Am I offending anybody? Not even, you're so far away, I could be offending you. Denial, to me, the 3 cornerstones of the intrapersonal. Denial, compulsion to set up and respond to challenges, and inability to tolerate distress. So, denial, I mean, this is something I recently came to. I realized that the way it works in the mind of a person is that the person who's addicted is always busy answering the wrong question. The question they're answering is, how will I know that I don't have a problem? Do you see how biased that question is? How will I know I don't have a problem? So I see a guy 6 months ago. He's been referred to me. He's had 2 DUIs. Everybody knows what a DUI is, right? Driving under the influence. For a consultation. So I see him, sits down, talks to me for 35 minutes, never mentions drinking. I said, excuse me, we've gone on now for 35 minutes. You've been telling me about this, that, and the other thing. But I have to tell you that Dr. So-and-so, who referred you, let me know that you had 2 DUIs. He said, yeah, that's right. I said, have you ever had any problems with drinking? I said, well, he said, well, maybe when I was in college, my parents were pretty worried. They sent me to counseling. I said, okay. I said, how are you doing now? He said, I think I've got things under control. I said, okay. I said, a lot of people would think that if you had 2 DUIs in a month, that would indicate that you were having a problem. But I have a feeling that you don't think that way. He goes, well, you're right. I said, well, would you illuminate it for me? I mean, would you explain it to me the way you think about it? How do you think about the fact that you've had 2 DUIs? He said, well, the first one, the law had just changed, and the blood alcohol level had been reduced to 0.08. And the other one, I was down the shore on a Saturday night, it was a spot check. And I said to him, so from your point of view, it was really more bad luck and bad legislation. That was the problem. To which he said, yeah. So at the end of the session, I took out a piece of paper. I sometimes pretend I'm writing a prescription because I'm a doctor. And on the prescription, I wrote out a question. I said, I'm going to write a question on this piece of paper for you, and I'm going to fold it up. And I don't want you to look at it until you leave. And I wrote on the piece of paper, how will you know that you are having a problem if you are? Question mark. Later that day, I got a phone call. He left me a message. This is so-and-so. Good question. Good question. How will you know you're having a problem if you are? Now, I think that idea could be developed with kids, for instance, with like as a prevention measure, where kids would develop a personal problem inventory, where they would say, the question would be, how will you know that you are depressed if you are? How will you know you're having a problem with social anxiety if you do? How would how will you know? Because in most problems, since we're a culture where we don't really want to have problems, because problems are bad, most of us, before we realize we have a problem, utilize what? Denial. Alcoholics are not really different in that way. We're all that way. Nobody's busy trying to know what problem they have. We're all trying to basically be okay, because okay means problem-free. We can all talk about how goofy that idea is. And the really key one here is the inability to tolerate distress. See, because that's the real motor for all of it. And that's what a lot of us have been talking about throughout this conference, is managing distress, tolerating it, mindfulness, meditation, welcoming your cravings without reacting to them. That whole set of skills, wisdom skills, life skills, the ability to develop those is undermined. Yeah.
Is this perhaps why FASD diagnosed individuals have so much more difficulty with owning?
I don't know that. What's an FASD?
Fetal alcohol syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
Or spectrum.
Oh, I did know that, but I just didn't.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I have a son who is fetal alcohol.
Oh, my God.
At birth, his birth mother was an alcoholic cocaine addict.
Mm-hmm.
We learned afterwards.
Right. That's.
And 3 generations. And he was okay until he was 16. And then his birth mother tried to contact him for the first time. And he reacted
Uh-huh.
and got arrested 2 days later.
Yeah.
And 2 years later, he's a homeless.
Oh, my
He's
God.
being homeless and on the streets.
And you're thinking, what are you thinking that?
And what I'm thinking is that because his maturity and his inability to have boundaries in place and his impulsive behaviors, all of those things that we work so hard to put in place,
Uh-huh.
that because the drugs have impaired his brain, and his brain was already insulted before that,
Mm-hmm.
that like the,
Oh, he's profoundly compromised, isn't he?
Yes.
I mean, profoundly
and
compromised.
I've asked every day that I've been here, and I work with FASD children as
Uh-huh.
well, but because I'm his mom,
Right.
I can't be his therapist.
Right.
All of that, and I just wondered if there's some wise pieces out here of somehow there's something that we don't know about how we can somehow help individuals like this.
Have you had him put away against his will?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And he doesn't stay, or he can't stay? Yeah.
And it's interesting because when he was really little, at
Right.
And so that was punishment for him.
Mm-hmm.
And
But he could tolerate it then, and you could control it.
yeah,
Because you could control his environment. Yeah.
And now, and his core pain is that he has such an issue with his birth mother never giving him a chance to be normal, and he won't deal with his pain about his birth mother.
No, it's just the pain. Well, I don't want to get into this too much, but I think the pain is the pain of his defectiveness.
Yes, it is indeed.
It's not about his. It's not about his mirth, but it's about his defectiveness.
Yes.
And how to come to terms with that. It's almost an existential issue, isn't it?
Okay, so if we say then, because he's extremely good at soccer, we wanted actually to take him to England when he was 14, because he was that good. So if we tried to focus in on making that his
Yeah, see, but at the end of the day, when you try to build people up and you show them their resources and so on and so forth, at the end of the day, we all have to come to terms with our unique requirements for living. You could call it defectiveness. In his case, he feels defective, okay, because he's not like other people, okay? But guess what? None of us are like other people. It's just that we don't feel defective about it. I mean, I'm doing a presentation on eating disorders. I'm sitting, I had a loose cap, and I'm busy cutting a bagel into pieces. If you have never done that, just get really old and you will. I'm cutting this bagel into pieces, and I'm eating this bagel like little chunks at a time. And I'm thinking to myself, what's the difference between the way I'm eating this bagel, this mindfulness eating that I'm doing, and what a person with an eating disorder has to do? And the answer I came up with was, I don't feel ashamed. I don't feel defective. I think I have a loose cap, and I don't want it to come out. That's all. No more, no less. It's a unique requirement for living that is mine, and I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to do it. A lot of people in AA have problems with higher power. The secular version of the higher power is your higher power is your unique requirements for living. The ones that apply to you, not the rules for everybody else, just the ones for you. One of the things that alcoholics have to learn is that my unique requirements for living are that I don't drink. I get migraine headache. I have unique requirements for living associated with it. I can't eat chocolate. Well, I can eat chocolate, but I'll get a headache. See, so I have to surrender to those unique requirements. Your unique requirements require attention and compassion. If you're busy not wanting to have any, if you're busy feeling ashamed because you have them, you see, it makes it very hard to accept them. I once worked with an alcoholic, and he told me that he never thinks about drinking. I said, oh, very good. He said, like normal people. I said, like normal people? He said, yeah, normal people don't think about drinking. I said, wrong. I said, normal people think about drinking all the time. Normal people monitor what they drink. They're aware of the effect on them. They pay attention to it very carefully. They make sure you don't do too much of it. And they don't drive when they're doing it. But see, in his view, if you're thinking about it, there's something wrong. At some point, we're going to need to take a break. Is this a good time to take a break? It's 3:30. We'll take a 10-minute break. Is that enough time for everybody? 10 minutes. The landscape, like a line in the Psalm book, is seriousness and weight and eternity. What we choose to fight is so tiny. What fights with us is so great. If only we would let ourselves be dominated, as things do, by an immense storm, we would become strong too and not need names. When we win, it's with small things, and the triumph itself makes us small. What is extraordinary and eternal does not want to be bent by us. I mean the angel who appeared to the wrestlers of the Old Testament. When the wrestlers' sinews grew long like metal strings, he felt them under his fingers like chords of deep music. Whoever was beaten by this angel, who often simply declined the fight, went away proud and strengthened and great from that harsh hand that kneaded him as if to change his shape. Winning does not tempt that man. This is how he grows, by being defeated decisively by constantly greater things. That's Rainer Maria Rilke, as quoted from a book called News of the Universe, Poems of Twofold Consciousness, edited by Robert Bly. And that poem expresses way better than I can the thing that's supposed to happen, or you hope to have happen, with somebody who is fighting this tiny thing called alcohol or drugs, and who is preventing themselves from a more liberating self-description. My wife informed me that I really should be going through the ideas a little bit more, so I'm going to do that, because she's usually right. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to move a little bit through the theory piece of this, because the theory is going to inform the therapeutic strategies or techniques or protocols. Now, I've talked about the intrapersonal context of addiction. Now, the interpersonal context, and I'm just going to read from this. Virtually anything that is done with benign intent in relation to an actively using person, without an understanding of the dynamics of addiction, is potentially enabling or colluding of the addiction. Turns out that whatever you do that comes naturally when you love somebody, in the context of addiction, is usually the wrong thing to do. So the organizing principle of the interpersonal context of addiction is collusion and enabling. At the cultural level, there's the belief in control, we've talked about that, the bias towards self-reliance. You see, I don't need you. Or let's say this, I don't want to need you. And so one way of getting around needing you is to comfort myself with some substance. I was interviewed on the radio recently about pornography, internet porn and addiction to it. I'm not sure it's an addiction, but I can tell you this much. If you're looking for a peak sexual experience, it's a hell of a lot easier to get it than having a date. It's a hell of a lot easier to have an intense sexual experience by yourself than it is to have it with another human being where you actually might have to talk to them. You see? To have, and I learned about this from working with a guy who was into sadomasochism. And like I do with most everything I don't understand, I wanted him to teach me about it. Because I didn't get what was so thrilling about sadomasochism. And the thing that was so terrific about it was that he knew exactly what was going to happen. Now, why would you want to know exactly what's going to happen? Because you're afraid. Because you're afraid of what might happen. You see? So the bias towards self-reliance gets appropriated in this distorted way, and I can give myself the experience that I would otherwise have to need you for. And I don't want to need you for all kinds of reasons. What I call the athletic worldview, and this is something I came up with when Len Bias died. I don't know if anybody is old enough to remember Len Bias, but he was drafted #1 in the NBA draft by the Boston Celtics out of the University of Maryland. And before he could go to camp, he died of cocaine. He died of a cocaine experience. And I ended up writing an article about what I called was addiction in the athletic worldview, where I talked about how athletes were predisposed to addiction and the why they were predisposed to addiction. And the athletic worldview, which is also, could be said, the corporate worldview or the Western-centric worldview or the George W. Bush worldview, is there are no obstacles that cannot be overcome. There are no limits except self-imposed limitations. And the value placed on challenging oneself and accepting the challenges when they are presented. This gets appropriated by the addiction process. And people are busy, proving that there's nothing they can't overcome. There's nothing they can't do. And then the bias against experiencing or expressing distress. Was it Ed Muskie who cried? A great senator from Maine who cried when he was campaigning for the Democratic presidential nomination? Destroyed his career. Can't be crying. Can't be doing that. We're not going to have any of that. So that's at the cultural level. At the organizational level, the preoccupation with performance and getting it done, and no matter what, just get it done, get it done, get it done, accomplish, accomplish, accomplish. People go without sleep. Doctors staying up, there have been articles about doctors being compromised because they're up all night long. Go, 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 go. If you've ever hung out with truck drivers, who, they just got to keep on the road, keep moving, keep eating those, the amphetamines, keep going. The really key thing, I think, in organizational structures and in family structures is how the limits of acceptable behavior just sort of gradually drift in the direction of more and more and more and more tolerance. So that after several years, a family that I worked with some time ago, the husband who was a plumber and the wife who was a nurse, well, the husband's income had gone down to just about zero. He didn't need to make any money because his wife was afraid the stress of work was causing him to drink. So she just worked harder and harder, took more and more night shifts. When Dad came home, the kids would walk around him in the living room because he'd fall asleep on the couch. You see? Something that would be remarkable the first time it happened becomes part of what family life is like in the Gallagher household. So a man who is required to support the family ends up with no financial role in the family, who's required to set some kind of an example for his children. Now, because nobody wants to disturb Dad, everybody works around it. So that happens in organizations as well. And it happens all the time. I mean, don't talk to your mother after a certain hour. Well, everybody, you don't even know how you know not to do that after a while. You just don't do it. And so what happens is the normal relational, structural, organizational consequences that would otherwise apply don't apply. And so the news that there's a problem that would come from the outside, since it's very hard to produce it from the inside because you're busy proving you don't have a problem, the news, that information doesn't get in because nobody provides it. Nobody provides it. On the personal level, it's very common, enabling behavior based on fear of rejection or attack. Why don't you say something to your husband? Well, I don't want to nag, I don't want to get him angry. All kinds of reasons why you don't give the person the information. I'm not saying they're bad reasons. I mean, if the man's likely to fly off the handle and throw something through a wall or hurt somebody, yeah. But it has the effect of enabling the addiction. Normalizing behavior, the same thing. Shared denial. I mean, many people, men in marriages get sober, and it turns out that the wife's a closet alcoholic. That she drinks differently than the man does. But she's been living a lonely existence for all these years, and she needs comfort, and he ain't there. And so she ends up having to get into recovery after he does, because the dirty little secret is that mom's an alcoholic as well. rescuing behavior. You see this with kids all the time, right? I'll never forget working in the prison system in Pennsylvania when I first moved there at Broad Meadows Prison. And I'm seeing this guy, and he's been in jail now. This is like he's 22, and this is his 5th roundabout. Go back. And always breaking and enterings, never armed, nothing terrible, so he gets 2 months, 6 weeks, whatever. And he wants me to meet his mother, so I meet his mother, this lovely Italian woman. And all she could say was, he's a good boy, he's a good boy, he's so worried about it, There was no sense of holding him accountable, no sense that his behavior had no meaning in terms of his membership in the family. There was no stake in it. There was no loss of anything as far as his primary social network, which was the family. A collusion in setting up challenges is a really important one, I think. Because a lot of times, years ago, this woman came to me and when she arrived at my office, she said, my husband's an alcoholic and I want him to get into a rehab. And I kicked him out. I said, wow, well, so you're pretty far down the line here. But he's refusing to go to rehab. What should I do? I said, well, I'm not sure what you should do, but I don't think you should necessarily back off. Has he stopped drinking? Well, yeah, he said he'll stop drinking, but he's not going to rehab. So he stopped drinking, but he won't go to rehab. I said, okay. So I saw her a couple times after the 2 or 3 sessions. She said, well, but he will come and talk to you. He won't go to AA, he won't go to rehab, but he'll come and talk to you. I said, okay, so bring him in. So we brought him in, nice enough guy, house painter. She had 1 child with him, seemed like a swell guy. Not drinking. How come you're not drinking? Well, my wife doesn't want me to drink. I don't have a drinking problem. She doesn't want me to drink, she doesn't want me to drink. I just quit. And so we talked a little bit more, and I don't want to go to AA. Well, I said to him, I've never really heard of anybody getting sober and staying sober, without AA. So I don't know if you're going to be able to do it. He said, well, I think I can do it. Okay. So lo and behold, the things are warming up between them, and they decide he's going to move back in. So the plan to move back in is on a Saturday. I'm supposed to have an appointment with them on Thursday. On Wednesday, I get a call from her. So I'm coming in by myself. It's over. It's over. It's over. It's all right. Comes in. Tell me what happened. Well, yesterday we went out to lunch. We're planning the move back and blah, blah, blah. And the waitress comes over and says, would you like anything to drink? And he says, yeah, I'd like a glass of wine. I said, whoa. So what did you say? She said, well, I told him I wish you could have just 1 glass of wine. I wish you could have just 1 glass of wine. And so he did. And that night, right before she called me, he called her on the phone. Honey, I just want to call you to tell you how much I love you and how much I'm looking forward to us being together again. He explained that by saying that the paint thinner had overcome him and he had. And so I said to her, do you think you're going to be able to accept that your husband's an alcoholic? And she says, what do you mean? I said, when you said to him, I wish you could have just 1 glass of wine, you were telling him that you didn't want him to be an alcoholic. And he was trying to be a good husband and proving to you that he could do what you wanted. See, the acceptance cuts across all the people. Everybody's got to accept it. Because if you suggest that you can't accept it, that person's going to try like hell because they don't have the best ego strength at this point. They're going to try like hell to do what you want, unconsciously want, or consciously want. In this case, she was almost conscious. I mean, who the hell wants to have a husband who has cancer? Nobody volunteers to have a husband who's got cancer. Let me get a guy with cancer. That sounds like a great plan. If you believe it's a life-threatening disease, nobody really wants anybody to have it. So it's tough to accept that they do. Interpersonal trust as dangerous to the addict. And this goes to what we were talking about, David. David works at a place, and he has to take urine specimens. And sometimes guys fail, and sometimes he wishes he could fudge the data. You know? But see, when you trust an actively using person, you're implying something we talked about earlier, control that they don't have. So it's not about trust. Drug testing is about policing for the purposes of the organization doing the policing, and it's about protection of the addict from the addiction. It's protecting the person from this thing that could destroy them. And I learned this from a physician who was a prescription drug abuser. He would raid the closet. He was a cardiologist, and he would take the medicine out of the, and he damn near lost his license. He did lose his license for a while. He came to see me as part of his treatment. And he was so indignant about being called up at 6 o'clock in the morning to give a urine specimen. He'd be called 6 o'clock in the morning, be down here in 20 minutes. Supervised urines. Watch him pee. Watch him pee. And by the way, if you didn't know, there's now a device, a fake penis, that you can fill up with someone else's urine. I mean, you can get around this stuff if you really, I mean, kids tell me this stuff. I'm like, you guys are something special. But supervised urine, so I don't know if you have to touch the person to make sure it's flesh or not at this point, but whatever. And he was furious. It was such an indignity to him. Until medication disappeared from one of the medication closets at the hospital. And he had all this documentation that said he was clean. And he was protected from the social consequences, because he would have been the first person suspected. In fact, he was suspected, but he had documentation, and he was clean. There's that level of protection, and then there's the protection associated with people relapsing. And knowing that they're going to be tested protects them and comforts them. So as much as I find the idea of, and I'm sure most of us do, when I first heard it, urinate, peeing, checking people's urines, how unseemly. No, it's not unseemly. I mean, people who are diabetic have to test their blood sugars many times a day. My mother-in-law has been diabetic for 20-something years. Every day she sticks herself and draws blood. I mean, it's about self-care. It's not about, blaming and shaming. This is the most common one: provoking denial through participation in escalating struggles without being prepared for a bottom-line position. Don't confront unless you have firepower. If you're not prepared to do something, then don't confront. Don't say, if you don't, then this, unless you really mean then this. And I've worked with plenty of people, many women who have, changed the locks on the house and say, don't come back. And if they're prepared to do it, it's very powerful. It works. But to just get into a confrontation and get into spinning your wheels in a reciprocal, conflict pattern, and then not do anything and wake up the next morning and back to square one, that just expands, it raises the level of catastrophe that has to happen for the person to realize there's a problem. It makes the catastrophe worse. And what we're trying to do in this whole therapy is lower the objectively catastrophic consequences to the event. When I hit bottom with cigarette smoking, nothing bad had happened. I might have worn my tires a little more going 85 miles an hour. I might have pitted the spark plugs a little bit more, But I stood there with